Welcome, everyone, to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series, weekly discussions of practice and science by experts in behavioral health and the law, hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, along with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director in the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences here in the University of New Mexico's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box anytime you feel comfortable. Know that we do hold those till the end. We try to get to as many as possible. Oftentimes, it's not possible to get to all of them. Just forgive us if we don't get to yours. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in in the chat box shortly. And if you are pursuing APA continuing education credits, there will also be a link in the chat, but in the latter portions of the presentation. So keep your eye on the chat box for that link. Open it before you leave the webinar, and make sure when you complete the survey that you save your certificate, because we don't have access to those after the fact. A recording link and PowerPoint slides for this talk will be available sometime later this week. And as a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we will have Dr. Laura Guzman-Osta, who will be joining us to discuss racial, ethnic, and cultural identity issues in court clinic evaluations. We'll then be taking off the week of Christmas and New Year and returning on January 9th, 2024. But let's focus on today and get back to this week. I'm very excited to introduce you to today's speaker, who'll be discussing a really understudied area of trauma and propensity for false confession. This is Dr. Lucy Guarnera. Dr. Lucy Guarnera is a licensed psychologist and assistant professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy. Her research seeks to improve the fairness and accuracy of the justice system, both by studying biased decision-making among forensic experts and by investigating the legal experiences of vulnerable individuals, particularly adolescents and victims of sexual violence. Her original research on the legal experiences of women who became pregnant from rape has been honored with the Best Dissertation Award and multiple grants from the American Psychology Law Society and the American Academy of Forensic Psychology. As a clinician, she trained in empirically based assessment and treatment of traumatic stress at the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center at Musk, the Medical University of South Carolina. She also completed a forensic postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Virginia. She currently conducts a wide variety of forensic evaluations with an emphasis on issues pertaining to interpersonal violence. Dr. Guarnera, Lucy, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, thank you so much for, again, joining our series. We're excited to have you sharing your expertise with us today. I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
Thanks so much. All right, so get a couple things out of the way. So I don't have any financial arrangements that I need to disclose. And these views are my own and do not reflect University of New Mexico. Okay, so thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm very excited to be talking to you today about trauma, interrogations, and false confessions. So briefly, I just want to tell you how I kind of got started in this area. So like many of you, forensics was my first interest and primary thing that I was researching and doing clinical work in when I was in graduate school at University of Virginia. And so I'd sort of anticipated that I would do a forensically focused clinical internship, pre-doctoral internship. And then when kind of the time came for it, I wanted to use that time to gain a new skill set. Since I'd already had some familiarity with forensics, I knew I'd be kind of circling back around to this world. And so I ended up doing a trauma-focused internship at the Medical University of South Carolina, where I was trained in empirically based assessment and treatment of traumatic stress. This linked into some of my prior research about women and sexual assault in the law. But because I now have these two kind of areas of specialty, which was trauma and forensics, I got asked by my lovely co-authors here, Dr. Haley Cleary, Dr. Jeff Aaron, and Megan Crane, an attorney, to be part of a theoretical paper that was trying to pull together the strands that were out there, potentially linking trauma with involved agreed to be on the paper and ended up getting published, and kind of because of that paper, which I'll talk about going forward, got invited to help us with a high-profile death penalty case where trauma and false confessions were potentially at issue. And then because of that case, have been invited to participate in many more cases where there's a disputed confession
and trauma is suspected to be one of the major issues. So I say this to tell you to be careful what papers you agree to, because you don't know what direction your work or your life can go in after that. I'm really very interested in this area and I've been enjoying it a lot, but it's not something I expected I would be doing, a year or two ago. Okay. So just to give you a sense of where we're going in this presentation, we're going to start with what we know about science and the law. Then gonna get out of that relatively limited realm of what we know, because as I'll say that we don't know that much for sure, and get into some educated guesses about mechanisms that might tie trauma with the risk for false confessions. And then because so many of you are clinical practitioners, forensic practitioners, I want to make sure that we focus on what this means for clinical and legal practice, and end with a real world case example that kind of puts us all, gives us an example to follow here. So let's start with what we know. So a brief introduction to the problem of false confessions. Some of you may be very familiar with this area, and this will be nothing but review. Some of you, this may not be something you know that much about, but false confessions happen, and they are a huge miscarriage of justice, both for the individual who is falsely convicted, and because for the justice system broadly, because we're allowing guilty people to walk free. So among known and proven DNA exonerations, about a third involved false confessions. This is, just the tip of the iceberg, because most false confession cases will never be proven conclusively. It's rare a situation where you have DNA evidence like that. So, we don't really know about total numbers, but it's a big problem. And so among these known proven false confession cases, we can see that young people are disproportionately represented. So about a third of those false confessors are 18 or younger, and about 10% have some sort of well-known mental health or capacity issue. So the other reason false confessions are such a huge issue in the justice system is that they are very hard for people to disregard. Confessions are among the most powerful and convincing forms of evidence. And once a confession has been made, even if afterward it's shown to be false or likely false, it's just very, very hard for judges and juries to disregard it. And courts are very unwilling to exclude confession evidence once it's been given. So your best bet is to not give the false confession in the first place, because it is hard to go backwards and have justice be done. So if you are one of those people who are thinking, I doubt this, like, how could this happen? There's a lot of reasons that are kind of grounded in basic psychology. So innocent people might confess because of the intense pressures of interrogations. So you may have heard of like the Reed method of interrogation. If you've ever watched any movie or TV show featuring an interrogation, this is what you'll see. So this is when they start with directly accusing people of the suspect of the crime, and then increasing stress and fear by, talking about the certainty of punishment, potentially by deceiving the suspect, saying they have evidence they don't have, things like that, saying they only have a limited amount of time. This is, or they need to make a statement or things go bad for them, basically ratcheting up the pressure, making the suspect more and more desperate to escape, to do whatever they can to get out of this horrible situation. And then kind of swoop in with this soft sell tactic called minimization, where the interrogators offer face-saving excuses, or kind of blame the victim, or otherwise make it feel like maybe it wasn't so bad. So maybe you didn't really mean to do it. Maybe you just got angry. Everybody gets angry sometime. And that sort of smooths the path to making a confession. At that point, the suspect feels like it's in my best interest to say this to get out of here, because maybe it won't be so bad later. Innocent people confess because they become exhausted and dysregulated, particularly when interrogations are very long. In some senses, innocence is a risk factor, because sometimes innocent people believe that their innocence will protect them. Like, it's okay to make a false confession now to get out of this horrible situation, because it's not going to stick. Like, everyone will realize that I'm innocent later. But of course, a lot of times that doesn't happen. People might be disorganized due to mental illness. They might be extremely compliant with authority figures if they've got intellectual disability or younger. Sometimes people make false confessions, not really exactly because of what police are doing, but for other reasons. They might be trying to take the blame for someone else they're trying to protect, or keep the real suspect from getting angry at them or hurting them, or might have other reasons, like, wanting notoriety or something like that. So many reasons people might falsely confess. So what are the courts to do when someone makes a claim, hey, this confession is false. This is not true. This person is not the actual perpetrator. So the courts have said that confessions must be made freely, voluntarily, and without compulsion or inducement of any sort. So this is called the voluntariness standard. Just a small technical point, technically the confession doesn't have to be false to be excluded. It just has to be involuntary. You can imagine somebody confessing to a crime they did commit because, you know, they were threatened with bodily harm, and that would be illegal. Even though the confession was true, as in they actually did do it, it would still be involuntary under our legal system. It would still not be allowed. And so how are people supposed to assess whether the confession is voluntary or not? Well, the answer is it's very squishy. So it's the legal standard is called the totality of the circumstances test, which basically means anything you think is relevant, no guidance about how to weight things or not. You know, sometimes specific states will have a list of factors to consider, but ultimately it's just kind of up to the judge, and they can think about it whatever way that they want. So sort of anything goes. You know, they're supposed to think about the circumstances of the interrogation. So, you know, for example, interrogation duration. And they're also supposed to think about the personal characteristics of the accused. So if we, what is specific to that individual and their vulnerabilities that might have made them more prone to the stresses of an interrogation. And again, you're supposed to think about both of these things, but it's unclear how they're supposed to be combined, what's important or not. It's really just totally up to the judge. So I wouldn't normally put in a huge long quote in a PowerPoint like this, but I love this quote so much that I'm putting it in here so that when you do false confession cases in the future, you will have this and come back to it and can use it, because I think it really highlights the way, how far we've come and how far we still have to go. So you might notice this is a Supreme Court case at the bottom from 1964. So this is quite a long time ago that the Supreme Court were saying these things. And what are they saying? Well, they're actually saying the right things that we as scientists would say this is right. They're saying that you don't need clear physical brutality to be involuntary, that we have, quote, more refined and subtle methods of overcoming a defendant's will. So they say that coercion can be mental as well as physical. These are all things, you know, as psychologists, we should agree with. And that given the proper subject, they might feel coercion. So saying that it matters who is sitting in the hot seat in the interrogation room. Not everybody is equally vulnerable. And concluding that, you know, we have a very complex task in determining whether the accused's will has been overborne. This is, you know, exactly true. Everything about this is right. And yet this is 1964, and still today in 2023, it is rare for a confession to be excluded. Even egregious confessions, like clearly false confessions or coerced confessions, are often not excluded. So we've got the vision here from the Supreme Court, and hopefully we're getting, you know, we'll move toward the reality, but we're not really seeing that yet. So what does psychological research have to say about these two factors that judges are supposed to consider, the nature of the interrogation context and the disposition of the individual? So these are research-supported risk factors for false confessions. Doesn't mean you did falsely confess if you have one of these factors, but it is raising the odds. And these will seem pretty familiar from what we talked about. So thinking about the interrogation situation, so coercive police tactics like deception, maximization and minimization, long interrogations, physiological depletion like lacking food or sleep, those all raise the risk. And then dispositional factors related to the individual. Again, these are pretty familiar at this point: young age, cognitive problems, psychiatric problems, having a particularly suggestive or compliant personality. And then there's this question mark at the end, which is trauma. So for trauma has not been included traditionally in the list of dispositional factors. It's only within the last maybe 5 to 15 years that researchers have started to look into trauma specifically as a risk factor that might raise the odds of false confession. So this is a very young field when it comes to empirical research and findings. And so good for you. It means it's quite easy for me to summarize because we have relatively little information so far. And I will happily share that with you. So before we get to those research results, though, I just want a note about trauma. So people throw that term around. It's become, very much like the hot thing in the legal system to talk about trauma and trauma-informed care and things like that. But what is trauma? When people say trauma, what do they mean? There's at least two things that could be meant. One could be traumatic events. So life-threatening or other sort of adverse or negative things that have happened in somebody's life. Or it could mean the consequences of those events. So post-traumatic mental health symptoms or other kinds of like personality changes or other sorts of changes that can occur because of trauma. And these are not the same thing, but are often used sort of in a muddy way in the legal system. And it's sort of unclear what we're talking about. And this matters because they're very much not one and the same. So here's my quick little primer on important things to remember about trauma that you may or may not know. So one is that most people are resilient to traumatic events and don't develop post-traumatic impairments, at least not severe ones that last a long time. If everybody, got PTSD when they were exposed to a traumatic event, then, the whole human race would essentially have PTSD and we wouldn't be able to function. So it's a relatively rare pathological reaction that only occurs in certain circumstances, depending on, a variety of things, the severity of the event, pre-event mental health problems, post-event, support and other events. There's all sorts of risk factors for developing PTSD or something similar. Trauma symptoms can vary a lot in duration and severity. So we'll be talking about timing in a minute. So just because someone has a traumatic event in their past, and just because they had some sort of mental health reaction doesn't necessarily mean that's still active at the time of an interrogation. It's an important thing to talk about and know about. A person can have post-traumatic stress without either having PTSD or having been diagnosed with PTSD. So PTSD is one specific trauma reaction, but it's far from the only one. Specifically among youth, many children who have been exposed to traumatic events and in fact are having like observable behavior and mental health problems do not meet the specific criteria for a PTSD diagnosis. Certainly many people who might meet formal criteria avoid treatment and so don't have a diagnosis in their record. I raise this point because the legal system is quite fixated on the PTSD diagnosis. So as we'll see in some court cases later, that kind of opens the door to let in evidence about trauma and false confessions, where if there's no PTSD diagnosis, sometimes courts are just like, no, it's irrelevant. I don't want to hear about it. And lastly, again, with a diagnostic issue, post-traumatic changes can be misdiagnosed, especially in youth. So all sorts of different, trauma can cause so many different sorts of problems that it can be slapped with lots of different labels, but it doesn't mean it's not trauma related. So thinking about that timing issue, like when is the trauma? This is important to think about when we're trying to think about what's going on in an interrogation, which is occurring at a specific point in time. So when we're talking about trauma, it could be adverse childhood experiences that are now over. So, someone who had a terrible childhood with all sorts of abuse and deprivation, but now they're an adult and they are being interrogated by police. That can still make a difference to them in an interrogation, as we'll talk about. You could have maybe more recent and active symptoms, for example, like a military veteran who has PTSD or other problems from a deployment that was, maybe a couple years ago, not way back in their childhood, but they've still got symptoms at the time they're being interrogated. That can make a difference in an interrogation. And one that comes up a lot in the cases that I've seen recently is what about a trauma that's entirely proximal to the interrogation? That's when the crime itself is the trauma. So this happens when usually when there's a death of a family member. So, a mother whose infant child has died and now they're being interrogated as the potential, murderer of that child. Or, a boy's sister has died and now he's a suspect for killing her. So in that case, maybe you have earlier traumas that you're dealing with or earlier traumatic stress symptoms, but you also have a very clear acute trauma that's happening right now. And most people do have acute post-traumatic symptoms right after a trauma that, for most people, they will fade over time. Few people kind of maintain that long-term post-traumatic mental health problems, but most people right after, their infant or their sister or whoever has died are going to be showing elevated post-traumatic symptoms, acute stress syndrome. Okay, so now I promised I'm going to get to the relatively small literature base that we have to go on so far, and here it is. So this is kind of part one, that we have a series of studies by Johnson and colleagues. So he is a very renowned false confessions researcher, one of the kind of first people to be researching this. He's Icelandic, so a lot of his studies are based in Iceland or other parts of Europe. And so his group has a series of at least 9 papers. It was 9 last time I checked. They might have done more since, but at least 9 papers that all have a very similar design. They're essentially self-report surveys of like large groups of European adolescents or young adults, where they ask them, check on this list of what bad things have happened to you in your life, and then check off this list, like how many times have you falsely confessed to police for a crime that you didn't commit. So, all self-report, all correlation, but we do find that a greater number of traumatic or adverse events correlate with self-reported false confessions. So what are we missing here? For example, we don't know anything about post-traumatic symptoms or changes. We just know that events happened. Of course, traumatic events are going to be correlated with a higher risk of post-traumatic symptoms, but we don't really know what it was about these individuals, like what the trauma was doing that potentially contributed to these self-reported false confessions. So that's kind of part one of the research base. And then part two, you'll recognize Johnson's name again, and Drake and some others. So this is like at least 18 papers at this point. There's probably more. And these papers are also, again, similar in design. They are bringing people into a lab and asking them, check the box about what sort of traumatic events have happened to you. And then they're having them do one or both of these psychological measures that are measuring suggestibility or coercion. So the GSS-2 is a Johnson suggestibility scale, and the GCS is a Johnson compliance scales. And so these were developed a while ago. They are frequently used in false confession cases broadly, whether or not trauma is at issue. And they essentially, compliance scales, the GCS is just a 20-item true-false checklist of the tendency to comply with others' expectations or demands. And you can get data from the individual. You can also get data from collaterals on the GCS. And the GSS-2 is a little less face valid, a little trickier. It is seems like a memory test. You read the story to the evaluee, and they have to remember what it says and try to recall it as best they can. And then you ask them questions about it. And some of the questions are sort of normal memory questions, but some are leading questions where you're trying to imply that something happened that didn't happen. And so you see how many leading questions they show suggestibility to sort of say, yes, I remember that happened, when in fact it didn't happen. And then this is the key part. You say, you have made a number of errors. We need to do this again. So you're giving negative feedback from the evaluator. You're supposed to say it firmly and strongly. You're not supposed to be nice about it. And then you do the entire thing again. So the implication is that the evaluee did something wrong, and maybe they better change if they want to, please you as the examiner. And so you ask the same memory questions again. They have the same about the story, the same suggestibility items, and you see, are they more willing to endorse these leading questions now? And then how much do they change from time 1 to time 2? How much are they willing to shift their answers? So, and these sets of studies, it's youth and adults and actually pretty young children too. And what do they find? Well, that traumatic or adverse events correlate with the suggestibility and compliance scores. So I do want to acknowledge that at least 2 studies have found null results with the same design. So this is kind of it. This is the breadth of the data that we have that is specifically looking at either trauma and false confessions, or trauma and like extremely closely tied constructs, because GSS-2 and GCS scores have been correlated with false confessions as well. So we kind of have 2 hops to get over there to say that trauma would be associated with false confessions. So what's the issue with the research here? I'm sure with your research methods backgrounds, you are all thinking it and yelling it at the screen right now, but it's that correlation is not causation. So we don't know what it is about trauma that is potentially contributing. We don't know possible mechanisms, and we don't even know if trauma is causal. Maybe it's just that there are shared risk factors that result in many traumatic events in someone's life, and a propensity to falsely confess. And we certainly don't know mechanism. So as to this point, there have not been any specific studies that have established potential mechanisms that might tie trauma to false confessions, nor have there been studies that have shown that trauma is certainly causal. So we're going to now leave the area of known research results and kind of move into the educated guesses part. So these are all drawn from basic science. You will probably recognize and not be very surprised by some of these ideas, but these are educated guesses that my co-authors and I have put forward as potential mechanisms to link trauma and false confessions. And we are right now working on some research to try to firm those up and see if they are accurate or not. So here's one possibility. So misclassification of post-traumatic reactions, especially like post-traumatic emotional numbing. So the first step to a false confession is misclassification as guilty by police. So police, for some reason, will begin to think that you are the one who did it. And that's when they kind of, they turn on the faucet for all of the potentially coercive or confrontational techniques that can pressure people to false confess. So something has to happen at the beginning for an innocent person to be falsely classified as the likely perpetrator. And so this happens all the time for all sorts of reasons, bad eyewitness testimony or bad forensics or other things that can kind of put somebody in the spotlight, even if they're innocent. But trauma may have a role to play here as well. So people's presentation, their emotional presentation can change because of trauma, and it can kind of go in one direction or the other. So sometimes people are very dysregulated after trauma, openly emotional, crying or angry or upset. And this can be seen as suspicious. So very famous false confession case, Jeffrey Descovich, police found him to be, quote, overly distraught at the death of a classmate. Kind of like, why is this guy so upset? It was just a girl in his class, like why he barely knew her. Why is he so upset and keeps going to her wake? And that's what got him classified as a likely suspect. And that's what got him in the interrogation room. And once he was in the interrogation room, then all the potentially coercive tactics start, and that led to a false confession. He was ultimately exonerated. But the one that I think is more important and more insidious, like harder to detect, is actually the opposite. So you'll probably know that many people don't respond to trauma, especially chronic trauma, with overt emotional outbursts. Many go the opposite way and become emotionally numb. This is a coping mechanism. It's essentially like if I can't get away from a trauma, I would rather feel nothing than feel these horrible feelings that come with the trauma. So I'm going to start feeling nothing. I'm going to feel not positive feelings, not negative feelings, nothing. This is sort of on a spectrum with dissociation. Dissociation is probably like the most extreme example of like, I'd rather feel nothing. I'd rather not even be in my body than feel the pain and distress that comes with these traumatic events. And so when people are emotionally numb, they seem withdrawn, they seem closed off, they seem indifferent, they seem callous. And I have seen this already in cases that I personally have worked where this is what puts people in the spotlight. So for example, another very famous false confession case, Michael Crow, his sister was found murdered in his home. He was only 14 at the time. His sister was 12. So they're both very young. And police thought that he was insufficiently emotional. So he wasn't sad enough. He wasn't crying enough. Whatever our vision of the ideal, victim or the ideal like grieving sibling, wherever that's coming from, he did not match that. And that made him suspicious. He was also eventually exonerated. So there is one direct investigation of this concept, sort of a conceptual investigation. I absolutely love this study. This was presented at APLS a couple of years ago. I don't believe it's published yet because I keep checking, by Jessica Salerno and others at Arizona State. But what they did is they got they made a bunch of fake 911 calls and got some real ones too. There are different conditions, but essentially got a bunch of 911 audio calls, like audio calls of 911s, people calling 911. And the ones that they made themselves, that they varied with actors, some had high emotionality and some had low emotionality. So the caller is either screaming, like, oh my gosh, like someone's been stabbed, like you got to come right away, like the ambulance needs to get here, I'm freaking out here. And in another case, they're more calm. And emotionality was like the strongest predictor of whether participants kind of hearing these calls believed that the 911 caller was actually the true perpetrator. So when the 911 caller was too calm, it seemed suspicious. And participants began to think, including police, began to think that maybe they really did it themselves. So I think this is really important. As I said, I've seen it a lot, and I hope that we get more corroboration of this idea. Okay, another possible mechanism linking trauma and false confessions is an overactive threat response. So, if you are exposed to chronic threat in childhood, this is going to damage your brain structure and function in a way that basically permanently makes you more sensitive to stress. You have like a chronically elevated stress reactivity at baseline. Like at any point, your stress level is somewhat higher. And so if you're put in a stressful situation, you're going to go from 0 to 100 a lot faster. Interrogations are very stressful. They are inherently, intentionally stressful. Police make them stressful on purpose because that makes it more likely that people will confess. They could interrogate you like in your home with your mom next to you, but they don't. They interrogate you in a room by yourself in a police station surrounded by a bunch of officers potentially with guns, because this makes you feel more stressed. And when you're feeling more stressed and fearful and you feel like there's no way out, you're much more likely to do what the officers want and confess. So folks who have even if the trauma is pretty distal to the interrogation, like, it's childhood adverse experiences that are long over, this can still make them more vulnerable in the interrogation room. And over and above this kind of elevated baseline stress reactivity, if there's something specific about the person's trauma symptoms that is being aroused by the interrogation environment, of course, that could cause like greater spikes of anxiety and distress, which will further impair, executive functioning and decision-making, and will potentially increase people's drive to escape or avoid the situation. Of course, avoidance is one of the primary coping mechanisms that comes with pathological post-traumatic reactions. Last time I encountered something like this, I almost died. So I want to get away from it. No matter what it is, I need to get out. I need to get away. And if you're in the interrogation room, confession, just cooperating with police, doing whatever they want, that is often perceived to be the only way to get out. And so, it's pretty easy to think of potential connections. So, if you were subjected to, child abuse by adult men, and now you're trapped in a small room with a bunch of adult men who are being harsh and authoritarian toward you, that could easily be a trauma cue that's really spiking your anxiety or arousing intrusive memories or things like that will make you very, very anxious and panicked. If you immigrated to the United States and were held in a cramped box truck for a long time where you couldn't get out, now you're in this super small claustrophobic room, maybe that's arousing kind of specific spikes of anxiety that will make you less likely to persevere in an interrogation. Okay, learned helplessness may be another one. So learned helplessness is, if you all remember back to our Psych 101, this is like Seligman with the dogs who kept getting shocked, poor dogs. And eventually they weren't able to escape from the shock. And when they knew that they couldn't escape, they just kind of laid down and took it, so to speak, because they knew there was no way to get out. So they stopped trying. They stopped trying to escape, and they just kind of resigned themselves to their fate. So people who are exposed to traumatic events, particularly like chronic trauma, where they're unable to escape or change their circumstances. So chronic child abuse would be like a classic one. In a intimate partner violence relationship where you feel like you can't get away would be another one, things like that. Sometimes people begin to cope with a kind of passivity or fatalism about like, there's just nothing I can do to change this. They're using a more avoidant coping strategy rather than active approach coping strategy to deal with the stresses, including potentially the stress of interrogation. So people may learn as an effective tactic to kind of deal with the bad hand they've been dealt, that mechanistic compliance or resigned submission is their best option in life. That's the best way for them to avoid or lessen harm. So you could imagine, for example, a child, a youth, where they have an abusive parent who blames them wrongly for things and screams at them and hurts them. And they've learned that if they're getting falsely accused of something they didn't do, it's better to just say, yeah, I did, whatever you say, Dad, because any kind of resistance is just going to get them more harmed. And so they've learned that in the past, and now they are going to apply it to this present interrogation situation. So a related but somewhat distinct, another potential mechanism is insecure attachment style. So, again, going back to Psych 101 or basic science, attachment is the bond between a child and a caregiver. And you really want a secure attachment where the child feels like, I know I have someone I can trust to take care of me and protect me. And so because of that, I feel confident and free to explore the world and learn new things because I know I can come back to my caregiver and they'll take care of me. If you have a caregiver who was abusive or unavailable, then you may develop an insecure attachment. So that can show up in a lot of different ways, but one way it can show up is now the child is very clingy. They're not confident to explore the world and be independent on their own because they worry if I leave my caregiver, I have no confidence that they're still going to be there when I come back. They haven't been in the past. And so sometimes people with insecure attachment, they can become very, very dependent and clingy. They seek reassurance and approval from others. Briere, the trauma expert, calls this other directedness, that you just look to other people to tell you what to think, what to do, how to feel. You're less of your own person because you weren't allowed to develop that as a child. You can see why this might matter in an interrogation context. So intentionally, the suspect is isolated from friends and family, and this makes the investigator the only source of human contact, especially for a lengthy interrogation that can last maybe hours. Everybody needs human connection. Everyone needs sort of reassurance from other people. And if you've got insecure attachment, you need it even more so. And the investigator you might come to see them more and more as someone who's is there to help you or on your side or just the best that you can get. So you see this in interrogations with kids a lot. It's really kind of sad and horrible to read, where stuff that the court sometimes interprets as nice behavior, like the investigator is like asking them about, their sports, and they are giving them food, and they are giving them advice, like life advice. The judge may see this as, oh, the interrogator is being nice. This isn't coercive at all. But that can actually sort of fool a suspect into thinking the investigator's on their side and it's okay for me to confess, particularly if they've got insecure attachment. And so this is actually Gudjonson's sort of leading theory in his papers on why we saw that connection between self-reported trauma and self-reported false confessions. He thought that insecurely attached youth might be more likely to, for example, take on a case for a peer because they want to please the peer or are compliant to a peer. So this would be a voluntary false confession, essentially, one that's not coming from police coercion, but where they're willing to take the fall for somebody else. And he thinks that insecurely attached youth are more likely to do that. Another potential link would be neurocognitive decrements that come with traumatic stress, particularly chronic trauma during the developmental period. So this is the analog to sort of the well-known finding that people with cognitive impairments like low IQ are at much higher risk for false confessions generally. So Davis and Leo have this really helpful concept called interrogation-related regulatory decline. It's a sort of cohesive theory on why people falsely confess, which is that people gradually lose their ability to self-regulate and do the things you need to do to resist the pressure to confess. So you need to be able to focus on questions. You need to keep your long-term goals in mind. You need to weigh pros and cons. You need to keep your emotions in check. All of these things require cognitive resources, and over time, they'll be depleted. And once they're depleted, you're at greater risk of doing something impulsive and foolish rather than kind of thinking about future consequences. So we know, particularly from some great research by McLaughlin, that chronic deprivation, like poverty or institutional rearing, and chronic threat, like abuse or other kinds of sort of overt trauma, they lead to impaired executive functions that this can last a pretty long time. So problems planning, focusing, anticipating events, controlling impulses. For example, if you are chronically deprived, you don't have a lot of stimulation growing up. The brain kind of operates on a use it or lose it principle. So if you're not using synapses that are intended for kind of complex thinking and planning, those synapses will get pruned and they'll kind of be gone. And you've got thinner cerebral cortex and fewer synapses devoted to executive functions. So obviously that can contribute to false confessions. There's been a lot of writing about memory issues and trauma. This can occur either because of these broader kind of cognitive impairments or because of specific trauma-related like memory disturbances, like dissociation, peritraumatic dissociation during the offense, which means you can't remember parts of it, things like that. And when people have memory problems, they're at greater risk for confession contamination, meaning that they are relying on, they're accepting cues from the interrogator and kind of working that into their false confession, which makes it seem like they're guilty, because it's like, oh, how do they know that he had a knife? Well, he knows because the interrogator told him and he worked it into his story. And so it makes it seem more credible, and these can be harder to throw out for that reason. All right, so I'm going to speed through this last section here to make sure that we have enough time for everything we need to do. But I do want to talk briefly about female false confessors and intimate partner violence, because this has been the primary area I've been working in. So for a long time, all the false confessor research was primarily about men, because men are, the bigger demographic committing all sorts of crimes. So the greater demographic falsely confessing, and also that they are more likely to be exonerated by DNA evidence because of the types of crimes they're being accused of. So they're more likely to be known false confessors. But we do see specific patterns among female exonerees. For example, they are often wrongly convicted of child homicide or crimes that never occurred, particularly claims that they killed a child of theirs when in fact the child died from unrelated medical causes. So this is a different pattern that perhaps has different implications for false confession evaluations. So Dr. Lenore Walker developed a database of female false confessors only, and found that intimate partner violence was extremely common and kind of a driving motivator for a lot of the women's false confessions of why they're saying that they falsely confessed to police. So women who were involved in violent relationships around the time of their false confession said sometimes they lied to protect the abuser out of love or out of fear. So they took the blame because they thought if they didn't, either that person would leave them or they would harm her or the children. Women are often very afraid of losing their children, and so are eager to seem cooperative or be cooperative. They don't want the abuser to take their child away. They're worried about CPS taking their children away, and this can drive a lot of their interrogation decision-making. That's another stressor they have at that moment. They're worried about losing their children. Women also often talked about internalized guilt over their failure to protect children. So if it's a child victim, like their child who was injured or died, they feel guilty because they remained in this violent relationship with an abusive partner who now has likely harmed or killed the child themselves. So I'm working on a case right now where the woman arrives at the hospital after a child was fatally injured and says aloud, oh my gosh, I've killed our baby. But she likely did not physically herself kill the child. It was her partner. She said that because she felt so incredibly guilty that she had remained with this person and now her child was dead. You often find similarities between intimate partner violence and these coercive police interrogations, that kind of specific trauma tie between these circumstances that can arouse like spikes in anxiety. So if you think about a classic Reid interrogation, what's going on? You're isolated from sources of support. You have a man or several men sort of being authoritative and loud. You have no way to get out. You are being told you're lying. You're being told you're wrong. You're being told you're stupid or you're bad. And you're being told that it's sort of being implied maybe that things will go better for you if you just listen to me and do what I say. And so you can see a pretty close tie between that situation and intimate terrorism, intimate partner violence. And so many women will say, this just felt like all of my violent relationships. I just did what they said because that's all I could think to do at the time. Okay, so what this means for your clinical and legal practice. I'm not going to give a broad overview of like false confession or disputed confession evaluations generally. There are a lot of great resources for that. So all of these recommendations are very specific to thinking about and investigating trauma when you have a disputed confession case. So step number one is make sure you assess traumatic stress well and in a detailed and valid manner. So assess their trauma history, ideally by using a structured instrument like the Life Events Checklist 5. I mean, there's a million out there, but make sure you're asking about the different types of trauma, so you're not missing anything. You don't get tunnel vision on just one thing or miss out. Make sure you're assessing post-traumatic symptoms and related like personality constructs, like that other directedness or dependent personality, things like that. So some good forensic instruments for trauma symptoms are the TSI-2 or TSCC for children. Those have validity scales and are looking at trauma symptoms specifically. CAPS-5 is a semi-structured interview for PTSD. The PAI has that dominance scale and other factors that may be relevant. Be sure to assess suggestibility and compliance. So you can use the GSS or the GCS. We probably would do that anyway in a disputed confession case, but might be particularly relevant when there's trauma at issue or it's suspected to be at issue. And as always, you want to back up these evaluation procedures with as many collateral sources as possible that can corroborate that the trauma occurred and corroborate any post-traumatic mental health problems or changes that the person has had. So records, interviews, you know. Okay, so once we've assessed traumatic stress, we want to assess, see if we can make a connection between that traumatic stress and the confession. So make sure to get a really detailed account of the defendant's account of the interrogation, including the broader context, like what happened before and afterward, like, what was the nature of the relationship that they were in? If it's a intimate partner violence relationship, like what was going on right beforehand? I have a case recently where the woman had just given birth and was planning to leave her partner, which her partner suspected around the time this is happening. So that's obviously relevant to the risk of him harming the child and her stress at the time. Carefully review investigative sources. So this could be videotapes or transcripts or audio tapes. If at all possible, you want videotapes, you want to watch them very carefully. Sometimes like news articles or other sources like police reports, they can all comment on kind of how the investigation happened because you're looking for potential connections with the trauma. For example, police misclassification. So if you see police saying something like, I see that you don't look like a grieving mother to me, something like that, that can be potentially indicating misclassification. I mentioned the interrogation records as well. So we're looking for any kind of nexus between the traumatic stress and the interrogation itself. So if we know about the person's trauma, we know about their trauma cues that maybe prompt stress for them, you can see if there are specific overlaps that made this person with their trauma more vulnerable. And a couple pieces of advice for report and testimony. So if it's applicable and accurate, make a PTSD diagnosis because this increases the likelihood of the admissibility of your testimony. And then a lot of what my reports are educating the court about misconceptions about trauma and the connection to false confessions, because there are a lot out there. So courts often have very like superficial or stereotypical ideas about trauma. Like, if you're not screaming and crying, then you're not traumatized. They get fixated on like flashbacks, like that's like the only thing that indicates trauma, like trauma equals flashbacks for the court sometimes. And you may need to emphasize that it doesn't matter whether the investigators knew about the trauma or not. That doesn't mean there was no impact of the trauma. We're not blaming them for not knowing necessarily, but that doesn't mean it didn't make the person more vulnerable. So very briefly, a couple court cases kind of driving home these points, hopefully making you not depressed about the way courts are running, but at least giving you a sense of what you're up against. So for example, in this case, the expert is talking about PTSD leading to difficulty concentrating, self-advocating, vulnerability to suggestion, right? These are the things that were relevant. And what does the court say? There was no more than a possibility that the defendant experienced a flashback to her childhood during the polygraph procedure. So completely ignoring the argument the expert is making and kind of focusing on this very stereotypical trauma symptom of flashbacks. Another one, this 17-year-old was diagnosed with PTSD actually, but the court said this is not relevant because she was calm and rational. So the assumption is, if you're calm, you can't be traumatized. Of course, this is not true. That may be emotional numbing that they're seeing. In fact, what looks like calmness is in fact a coping mechanism. And lastly, in this case, an expert said the defendant was susceptible to coercive tactics because they had PTSD. This was a veteran. And the court says, well, we don't care because the agents interviewing them, they didn't try to exploit his PTSD. He didn't even tell them about his PTSD. So like, how can you be blaming the investigators for that? Again, it doesn't matter whether the investigators knew or not, they would still be vulnerable. I find this funny. He did not disclose his PTSD until 20 minutes into the interview, as if that should have been the very first thing he said to police. I don't really understand that, but you will see this a lot, that sometimes courts interpret things backwards, that something that actually makes things worse for the defendant they see as positive. So for example, oh, the cops drove somebody to the interrogation room. They drove them to the police station. Aren't they nice? Like, what nice people. But of course, that means if you are there, it makes it harder for you to leave. So the suspect feels even more trapped and even more isolated, because if they want to leave, they have to like ask those detectives for a ride, which could be very, very difficult. All right, so very quickly, I just want to give you one case example. So this is the Melissa Lucio case, and I'm able to use her face and name because this is all public information. This is posted on the Innocence Project website. All of her clinical information, my affidavit for the case, everything. So normally I wouldn't use somebody's name, but it's all right in this case. So this is a very well-known case. She was going to be the first Hispanic woman to be executed. She was on death row in Texas for many years and recently had a stay, in part because of this new evidence. And it just gives her case gives a pretty clear view of how trauma specifically and intimate partner violence can come into play. So the situation is that she has a horrendous abuse history. So sexual abuse her whole childhood, married at 16 to escape the abuse, and she had 5 children by age 23. That father of those children abandoned her. She remarried and gave birth to 7 more children. So she has 12 total children with an abusive man who threatened to kill her if she would leave. And the youngest child, Mariah, is the decedent in this case. She died when she was young, I believe about 2 years old. And very financially precarious. They were constantly moving from one place to another. And what prompted her confrontation with police is that Mariah wasn't breathing. They called the ambulance to come rescue her. And they were saying that Mariah fell down the steps. And when the ambulance came, they were at a home with only 3 steps up to a porch. And so the ambulance, the first responders saw this as suspicious. And what they didn't know is that because of their poverty and constant moving from one place to another, this is actually the place where Mariah had fallen down the steps. This was a previous house, and they had literally just moved to a new home, the one with the 3 steps, a couple of days before. So already we've got a misclassification issue going on because of not understanding the woman's context. And then even further, the first responder says, quote, Melissa wasn't really crying or showing a whole lot of emotion. She didn't act at all like what I would expect of a mother. So now we're entrenching that misclassification as guilty even more because of what's likely emotional numbing in the wake of an acute trauma, like her daughter had just died or been in danger of dying, on top of this horrendous, long-lasting trauma history. So that's kind of step one, is this misclassification. And you see this again from the investigator. So they say during the interrogation, which lasted 5 hours, it began less than 3 hours after Mariah had died. It lasted until 3 in the morning, and Melissa was pregnant with twins at the time. But even so, the investigator said, her head was down, shoulders slouched, not making eye contact. Right then and there, I knew she did something. So again, misclassification of post-traumatic emotional numbing or general anxiety. Anyone could be anxious in interrogation, show these things. So it's more likely if you've got trauma. As things go on with the interrogation, you can see that there's a direct tie between the trauma she just experienced, the death of her child, and the violence that she faced and the tactics that the police used, which probably made her more vulnerable to falsely confess. So the interrogator is saying things like, if I beat you half to death like that little child was beat, I bet you'd die too. There was some implication that she wouldn't be allowed to go to her daughter's funeral unless she started confessing and cooperating. So that's in the background, saying you owe it to her to confess, saying she'd look like a cold-blooded killer without confession when her daughter had just died. I will go ahead and end there. Fortunately, after many years in prison, this information is coming to light. Good Johnson and others did a clinical evaluation of her. I offered a scientific affidavit, and she is currently not on death row as her case is being reconsidered. But you can see several of the potential mechanisms I spoke about in action in this case. So I've got some resources here for you. If you're interested in this for the future, you can just come back to this slide. And I'll go ahead and end here for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Guarnera, for that thorough overview. What an understudied topic that, of course, is quite relevant to a number of potential cases here. We do have a couple of questions in here for our audience. If you have other questions for Dr. Guarnera, go ahead and enter those in the Q&A box. I would encourage those that are pursuing APA continuing education credits to check the chat box for the links, as well as those that are pursuing medical education credits. Just make sure the link works for you and that you can get all of this working for your CE credits. One question that we had here, somebody noted that many police divisions are moving toward non-coercive investigative interviewing approaches like the PEACE model, rapport-based interviewing. And they're interested in your thoughts about how trauma may still increase risk for false confessions when these non-coercive approaches are being used, and what officers need to be thinking about when questioning individuals to take a trauma-informed approach.
Yeah, great question. A couple things. So the PEACE model is clearly the recommendation, best practices. It's where things are going. Non-confrontational approach, not leading questions, kind of productive interview strategy. I will say there have been there's some research suggesting that it doesn't always stay that way, that even in peace countries where investigators are trained in this method, it can still become more confrontational over time. We also know very little about how people perceive these interrogations. So even just being in a police station, being spoken to about a crime, being targeted, being alone in a room, all of these things, even without the maximization, minimization stuff, people may still experience it as quite stressful. So many of these factors could still apply, even if they're less severe. When it comes to what officers should do, the example that I like to give is we already have a great model for how to interview people with the greatest accuracy who have been traumatized. And that's like child advocacy center models or forensic interviewing models for victims or witnesses. In those interview procedures, there's every possible concern is taken to make the person feel comfortable, to make sure you're not contaminating the information you're sharing, to make sure they're not feeling pressured or scared. And those are done for a reason so that they can gather the greatest amount of information that is most likely to be accurate. So I don't foresee police in America sort of taking that up for suspects anytime soon. There's always the concern about public safety and losing confessions, losing cases. But I would argue we kind of already know what works in interviews with vulnerable people. We just choose not to do it when the person is labeled as a suspect rather than a victim or witness. So I would look to those interview models for kind of inspiration for the future for police.
Okay, thank you. And going along the lines of those references to child advocacy services and interviewing models related to that, any implications for how trauma processing or trauma issues being potentially different for juveniles versus adults, how that would affect police interviewing with children versus adults that have experienced trauma?
Yeah, so the original paper I wrote on this was about juveniles specifically, and there's an upcoming chapter on juveniles. I mean, I think many of these potential mechanisms apply to both kids and adults. Some, like the intimate partner violence connections, probably much more to adults than kids, although they may be in abusive relationships as well. Kids, you're just kind of it's just sort of the same factors, but more so because you're laying on top the already vulnerable position of youth in regards to interrogations. So yeah, and also their trauma may be much more recent. So when you're talking about adverse childhood experiences, they might still be in that home. They're already going to be much more compliant with adults because the difference in power between them and an adult is greater than it would be between an adult suspect and an adult. So I would say that the proposed mechanisms are largely similar, but there may be some kind of flavors of difference, and that juveniles are almost certainly more vulnerable. Again, we already know that they're more vulnerable. And so if we layer on these trauma symptoms, then things could be even worse.
Great, thank you. Someone asked how often individuals who falsely confess with trauma histories know that their trauma histories were impacting their interrogation behavior. Do they have language to express that, or even any kind of awareness of this?
Yeah, so they may or may not. It really just depends how insightful the person is. Sometimes they will because they felt a way at the time when the stress was so incredibly high. My child had just died, or I was in this room for 6 hours. And then when they're not in that situation anymore, they can recognize the connection between their trauma. So they might be able to talk about it, or you might need to look for it yourself. I mean, if they talk about a very confrontational interrogation and they talk about a lot of intimate partner violence, even if they don't themselves make the connection and say something like, oh, wow, I was scared of those men because I've been scared of men all my life, you can potentially make that connection. You can investigate it and look into some of those factors for them. So I think it depends. I do sort of related, I guess. I think it almost never happens that the person will say in the room to police, like, I have trauma symptoms right now. So you're rarely going to get that in an interrogation video or transcript, but it doesn't mean it wasn't going on.
Definitely. Thank you. Someone noted that they've stopped using the Johnson compliance scale because of, as they described, ridiculously high face validity. And we're wondering if you had any alternatives that you could suggest.
Yeah, so whenever I use that, I say this has no validity scales and it's face valid, so it needs to be used in the context of a more comprehensive evaluation. Like, I'm never going to hang my hat on that alone for exactly the reasons that you say. It is a 20-item true-false checklist. The only thing that's good about it is that we do have norms, which is better than just sort of a unstructured clinical assessment. Other than that, I mean, if you can do, like, the PAI has, as I mentioned, that dominance and warmth scale, which I pretty much always ignore in forensic evaluations, except in false confession cases where someone's presenting as really compliant and likely to be swayed by figures in authority. And of course, like, the PAI does have validity scales. Otherwise, it's going to be, the best forensic work you can do of trying to get as many sources as possible saying, oh yeah, this person is very compliant. And so, like, specific examples that family or friends might mention or that are in records can be really helpful. Like a recent case a colleague was telling me about, where the person's sister was like, and multiple people were like, oh yeah, you can get him to believe anything. Like, even very recently, like, if I broke something, I would say, you broke it. Don't you remember? You broke it. And he would say, oh yeah, I guess I did. And that happened all the time. Of course, you hear that from only one person. Maybe they're trying to craft things for the sake of helping their family member. But if you hear that from a lot of people, you can do better.
How would this discussion and our admittedly limited understanding of the applied issue of clinical trauma in interrogations, how might this understanding translate to racial cultural trauma with people in an interrogation room with officers and their propensity to falsely confess?
Yeah, so this is kind of going back to the issue of what do we mean by trauma? And sometimes it can be used very narrowly for a specific life-threatening situation, like DSM-5 PTSD diagnosis excludes like trauma from just watching like TV or news or something. So in that very narrow sense, maybe it wouldn't apply, maybe it would, but in a broader sense, people absolutely do use the word trauma and talk about the concept of the racial stress and fear that Black Americans and other Americans of color go through when interacting with police. So, maybe it wouldn't qualify for a PTSD diagnosis, but if you've seen, many videos of police brutality at the hands of officers towards Black individuals, that can jack up your stress and fear as well in an interrogation. So absolutely, this could be another potential source of trauma and increased anxiety and increased compliance and self-protective instincts. So even if the officer isn't making overt threats, which are of course illegal, somebody who is, has racial stress in their background may be more prone to interpret the things that the officer is saying or doing as threatening, with the knowledge that, well, police hurt Black people all the time. So this person could hurt me at any moment. So thank you for that question. I should have included that in my PowerPoint, and I'm sorry I didn't. So I'm glad this was brought up.
Sure thing. And final question to kind of wrap this up a bit broader. Somebody asked, as interrogators are complicit in eliciting false confessions, generally, what changes in their training should be introduced?
So there are already interrogation training services, groups that use best practices. So things are changing and continue to change. The situation is different than it was 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So things are going in a good direction. Because at base, the way that, for example, we were able to change a lot of laws regarding recording of interrogations is that this protects you, the police officer, as much as it protects the suspect. This is a good thing for both of you, because now you have a recording of exactly what happened. And I think that angle can work here as well of, first of all, you don't want to get the wrong person. And here's all this evidence for how you can get the wrong person, even if you don't think you can, you really can. And you don't want your confession to get thrown out and ruin your case. So if you do things kind of the best way that we know, and again, there's probably no way to interview someone about a crime where they won't feel some kind of stress or pressure. It is inherently stressful, but we can still be doing better with the things that we already know are better, like avoiding contamination, avoiding introducing information about the crime, avoiding implicit threats or implicit leniency, not using false evidence ploys. There have been states recently that have passed laws preventing police from lying to juvenile suspects about false evidence, which is very convincing to people. So we know the right things to do to improve things. It's going in a better direction. And I am hopeful that things will continue to get better in the US as they've already gotten better in many other countries.
Well, Dr. Guarnera, Lucy, thank you so much for this presentation. I think I can safely speak on behalf of most of the audience here in terms of saying how thankful we are for you doing this work, and perhaps hopeful that more clinicians and more researchers can get involved in this particularly crucial area. That wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. We hope to see you next week when Dr. Lara Guzman Osta will be joining us to discuss racial, ethnic, and cultural identity issues before we take a 2-week hiatus. Until then, we hope to see you next week, and take care.